we had a pre-meeting with our two presenters today, Michael Dunning and Dave Cook, and it was wonderful because they came up with a very creative solution over coffee, and ideas started how to meld affordable housing with brownfield properties. And so I think it's really innovative. So I'm very excited that they're here. By the way, I'm Jennifer Terry, the director of the Environmental Law Initiative. And so thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I know that we have people registered from all walks of life, including city elected officials and some scientists as well in the audience. So in terms of I'm going to start off by introducing our presenters today. Michael Dunning is a partner at Perkins Coie. He is an environmental lawyer and he has particular experience in matters involving contaminated sites, aka dirty dirt. He previously served for more than a decade as an assistant attorney general for the state of Washington and acted as lead counsel on some of the state's most challenging and complicated contaminated sites and cases. As the former section chief of the Washington Attorney General's hazardous waste cleanup section, Mike led a team supporting the state's Department of Ecology on all aspects of contaminated sites. His insider's view informs his innovative solutions for business, local government, and nonprofit clients in litigation, transactional, and permitting matters. Mike's depth of knowledge of Washington's Superfund law, the Model Toxics Control Act, includes experience as an expert witness. For clients with cleanup sites and brownfield redevelopment projects, Mike has negotiated numerous complex settlements under state and federal cleanup laws. He has helped clients obtain millions of dollars in cleanup cost funding, enabling successful redevelopment of contaminated properties. Mike has pioneered a new approach to brownfield cleanup and funding for nonprofit affordable housing developers that clears traditional obstacles to contaminated site redevelopment. He's also a University of Iowa College of Law alum. I'm happy you're here. Our other presenter today is Dave Cook, who is the senior principal geologist at the State of Washington Water Research Center, Geoscience. Dave is adept at projects that require creative strategies, detailed budget tracking, unique technical decisions, and communication with multiple involved parties. This involves a lot of communication, reading through the court documents. He has a long and successful history of leading projects from due diligence through cleanup, redevelopment, and regulatory closure, transforming brownfield properties into productive uses. Examples of such work include overseeing a large cleanup of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation headquarters, as well as due diligence and cleanup oversight of Amazon's 8-city block headquarters in downtown Seattle, and large multi-acre headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. As leader of Geoscience geothermal services practice, Dave guides multiple heating and cooling studies across the United States. Several such projects address the feasibility of tapping groundwater from flooded underground mines in areas where data centers are being considered. In service to his profession, Dave often lectures at universities as an affiliate professor, and he has served on committees with the Urban Land Institute and Downtown Seattle Association and Engineering Change Lab. And as a volunteer with Engineers Without Borders USA, Dave served as a mentor on water projects in Bolivia and Peru on the board of directors, and in 2016 as president. So we've got a great program for you today. After they're done presenting, you can write questions you might have on the cards that are on the tables in front of you. Emma will help us collect those, and we'll run through the questions at the end. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for your questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, we will hand the microphone and the screen over to you, Mike. I think you're good at running the slides, so you can take it from here. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Jennifer. And hello to everybody. It's still morning out here in Seattle. I don't know if you can see, but I do have my Iowa Law School mug that I still have after 25 years since I graduated in 1999. So it's really good to be back at Iowa Law School, at least virtually today. So what we're going to do is Dave and I are going to really use a project that he and I worked together on to go through that, but kind of as a case study about sort of the topic of this conversation, which is how lawyers and scientists work together to solve environmental problems. So let me see if I can work the technology and share my screen. So Jennifer, I think I just sent you a request to share.
You were allowed access, so you should be able to share.
All right, one second. All right, can everybody see that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes? Thumbs
Yeah.
up?
Yep,
Okay.
thumbs up.
All right, awesome. Well, so what we're going to talk about is, so Dave and I's client, the Mount Baker Housing Association, and their affordable housing project in South Seattle that they called the Maddox, which Dave and I will explain as we go through the slide deck. So we kind of want to use this project as a case study for how we work together. All right, so I'm also advancing the slides. There we go. All right, so what you're looking at here is the location. This is in the south part of Seattle. And you can see sort of in the smaller inset, where the site location is within the city. And then the larger inset, you can see where it says conceptual site plan shows where the project was planned. And just a little bit, and Dave jump in here, but just a little bit about Mount Baker Housing Association, or MBHA. So they're a local Seattle, for many decades, nonprofit affordable housing, not only developer, but they also run the housing, and they provide services to their residents. Their name, Mount Baker, refers to the neighborhood that where they do most of their work in Seattle, that what's called the Mount Baker neighborhood, which is right smack dab where this project is located. And the project is located, if you look at the larger inset, just across the street, and we'll show you this on another slide. This is right next to one of the light rail stations in Seattle. So this is what is known as transit-oriented development, as well as being a brownfield site. Dave, anything to add?
I don't think so on this slide.
All right, so let's move to the next one.
Yeah, and I'll on here, you guys. Again, thanks for Zoom quit unexpectedly. Am I down?
We can hear you, but you're
Okay.
frozen. There you go. We got you.
Okay, cool. Great. So thanks for the invite, you guys. We're looking forward to talking to you more about this project and answering questions. So this is a zoom in of the prior graphic that Mike just shared, and in blue is the Maddox project. It's composed of two different properties that span both north and south of McClellan Street. So the client called this project Maddox North and Maddox South. And in the green box is the transit-oriented design in the Mount Baker light rail station. The big white rooftop there to the left or to the west, northwest, is a Lowe's garden store. And then to the south is Roosevelt High School, and that's their track and football field. And so a couple things that we were concerned about entering into this development for our client, Mount Baker Housing. And you'll see on the next slide that there are sources of no surprise, you guys, that this is a brownfield site, so it was contaminated. And we knew that one of the properties, Maddox South, was definitely contaminated soil and groundwater because a gas station sat on that property. What we suspected was to the north that it also was contaminated because a dry cleaner had existed on that property for many decades. And the definition of a brownfield is known or suspected contamination of soil, groundwater, or even the soil gases that emanate from plumes in the soil and groundwater. So those were the concerns. And so automatically, when you're talking with clients, we were saying this could be a costly redevelopment, both to clean up the dry cleaning contaminants that we suspected and the gasoline contamination and petroleum contaminants that we knew still existed on the gas station site or Maddox South.
That's right. And so when our client came to us, their vision was, look, we're a mission-driven organization. Our mission is to develop and run affordable housing in the Mount Baker neighborhood. These properties are up for sale. It's right in the heart of the Mount Baker neighborhood. It's by some of our existing affordable housing. And so we, Mount Baker, really want to purchase and redevelop these properties, but we know, as Dave just said, we know a little bit about them. We know about these past uses, and we know that there's at least some contamination on the Maddox North. We don't really know yet what's on the south. Can you guys help us purchase, redevelop, clean up, and solve our liability challenges? So that was the series of issues that the client presented to us to help them ultimately get to their goal, which was to redevelop the site, clean up the contamination, and build the affordable housing. And so as the lawyer part of the team, Dave talked about the technical challenges, what's there for contamination. The biggest challenges we had to also solve for were they had to purchase these properties. The properties were, of course, contaminated. And so what were the terms of those purchase and sale agreements and negotiating those sale terms with the owners? As Dave and I will talk about in a little bit, we know that there's some contamination. How much is it going to cost to clean that up? And what are the potential sources of funding to fund those cleanup costs? And then they're going to have to finance the actual development. So when the actual construction of the affordable housing is built, they're going to have to go out into the market and get financing. And lenders are often very uncomfortable financing on contaminated sites. So how do we solve for that? How do we get the lenders comfortable with our strategy to resolve the liability and clean this up? All right, so let's go to the next slide. Dave, you want to take
Okay.
this?
Yeah, and this just continues on what I just described. So on the left side is the former gas station building. We learned in due diligence or the review of historical documents, regulatory lists, that this gas station was operated by Phillips 66. Although it says something like auto retail, that was the second generation use of this building. And then on the right side, this was an operating dry cleaner. But what this historical photograph told us is that it went back many decades into the 50s. And during a period when we know through experience that dry cleaning solvents were very unregulated. Chlorinated solvents cause cancer and they're vaporous, so vapors can migrate up into the building. So this was a red flag in due diligence. The gas station was a flag, but we knew about it, and we had reviewed documents done by other consultants on behalf of the oil company. And they were making claims that the gas station site was clean. And so you always go into a conversation with your client about this as, well, wait a second, let's check it out. We'll review their documents and look for data gaps. And I was on the phone with Mike many times during this due diligence process to say, Mike, we hear and are reading what the oil company's consultant is saying, but boy, there's data gaps related to the extent of groundwater contamination. We don't think they removed all the contaminated soil. This is not going to be a clean transfer of the gas station property. And then um, uh, time would tell on the dry cleaner. We needed to do some actual investigation on the dry cleaning property because it had never been explored.
That's right. And as Jennifer said in her, introduction, that, at some point pretty early on in this process, as Dave and I were sifting through this and understanding the client's goal, you know, and Dave, you'll remember this, we just went out to lunch together to just, tire kick, strategize, like this is a tough nut to crack. What are you seeing, Dave, from a technical perspective? What are the risks? What are the red flags? And me beginning to talk to Dave about potential strategies for, what might the terms and conditions be for buying these properties, how we might solve the client's liability issues. And these issues are interconnected, right? The sort of the solving the liability legal issues, doing the cleanup, how much is it going to cost? These issues are all completely interconnected. And so it was really important for Dave and I to meet early on and collaborate about what we were seeing. All right, so let's skip to the next one.
So next step, this is a graphic of Maddox North. This is the dry cleaner property. And on the east side, and this Maddox North redevelopment was composed of 4 parcels with 4 different owners, which was a complication in itself. And we might talk about that during the Q&A, how that assemblage all came together. Our client was incredible in navigating the purchase of these 4 properties. And if you couldn't purchase these 4 properties, they really didn't have a project. So now what do these dots mean? Each one of these circles here represents an exploration where we brought out a small drilling rig, which is shown there on the left. And this is one of our key tools on getting soil and groundwater information and soil gas. And the way we code these graphics is a representation of the chemical results. So this solely represents chlorinated solvents in soil. And so everything in red exceeds a cleanup level. Everything in yellow has detected chlorinated solvents, but less than a cleanup level. And then green is clean. So, and a couple things during this that a geologist or an environmental engineer does as in piecing together the pieces of the puzzle of the history is, okay, well, it sure looks our highest concentrations are there on the north. Those are the cluster of red dots. Why is that? Well, we learned that that's where the dry cleaning machines were located, and there were cracks in the floor. In fact, part of the floor was just wood and open wood down to the ground. And so they were definitely, through history, dumping dry cleaning solvents on the floor or just discharging them down into the ground direct. And so the reason we wanted to get access to all 4 properties is because we knew through other research that the groundwater flows from the up to down or north to south on this graphic. And with a component to the west. So we wanted to explore further to the west.
You want to go to the next one, Dave?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. And now, a year later, we installed a bunch of monitoring wells across the whole neighborhood. And this is the groundwater plume. So you can see the yellow zone up there in the northeast corner of the dry cleaner. That's the primary source. That was the hottest of the hot soil. And then that contaminated soil, solvents leached out of that soil, got into the groundwater, and then flowed to the south and to the west, which now it's underneath the gas station, the Maddox South project. It's underneath a neighborhood. It's underneath rights of way. It's crossed other people's property. It's almost to the track of the high school. So it is a monster plume, which is a significant technical and environmental issue. And put yourself in the client's shoes. They're like, we're a nonprofit. I mean, what's this going to cost? And we had already counseled them that it was millions of dollars, which really didn't scare them. And I think, Mike, maybe you can talk to the client's feeling at that time, because I was passing information to Mike. Mike was talking to the client. Then I get called in to talk about the technical things and present this type of data. And Mike and I were already thinking about, where can we go? How do we fund this thing? One of the funding pieces, which I think is one of our, well, I'll preview. We're going to talk more about funding pieces.
And
Yeah,
here's
okay,
the-
this is great, Mike. So here's just a conceptual site model of releases from the dry cleaning machines. On the left side, went down through soil. Maybe they put solvents in a tank that we found back in an alley back behind the dry cleaner. Got down in soil, got into groundwater, which is the purple. It mixed with petroleum contamination in groundwater underneath the gas station, which you would think would be a horrible scenario, but petroleum actually helps degrade solvents, so that was a good thing. And continued down from left to right. Well, we'll come back to the funding piece in a minute. There are multiple pieces to that.
For sure. So as Dave and his team were, poking those holes and doing the sampling and understanding all of that, as Dave was saying, our client was, it's a small, nonprofit affordable housing developer, does not have gazillions of dollars in assets or in the bank. And so we're concerned about, the costs of this, but we're also concerned about taking on the liability. I mean, if we just jump back up really quick, as Dave was describing, that's a really big environmental problem. That's a large groundwater plume with, chlorinated solvents, which is a human carcinogen above the state cleanup levels. And so that's the liability or the project that they would be taking on, and that's a kind of a scary thing for a nonprofit, small
And
nonprofit.
and one other thing, Mike, I think if you buy the property, you buy the problem. So
Right,
that's a
right.
simple way to think about it.
Exactly. So Dave, you're, going right to the right conversation. So on the liability side, let's put the costs aside for a second. Everybody's heard of, the Superfund law, which is the federal contaminated site law, and the concept of polluter pays. Well, as Dave was just describing, that's not always the case. And so what these cleanup laws do, and we in Washington, we have our own parallel to the federal Superfund law that's called the Model Toxics Control Act, or you'll maybe hear Dave and I refer to it by the acronym of MOTCA. That's how we refer to it here in Washington. It's a status-based statute like the federal Superfund law, which is anyone that not only is the polluter, but anyone that becomes an owner of contaminated property becomes jointly, strictly, and severally liable for all of the cleanup and all of the liability, regardless of whether you have caused or contributed to the contamination. So that's the daunting liability that any developer who's not a polluter that comes to a brownfield site and says, I want to redevelop this site, they're going to take on that liability to the state of Washington to clean it up. And so that's, for Mount Baker, that was like, wow, that's a pretty scary prospect. How do we solve for that? And as you see in the second sub-bullet here, liability is for the site, not the property that Mount Baker's going to buy. So if we fly back up to this slide, under the state cleanup law, under MOTCA, the site is not just the property from which the release occurs. And so, as Dave was describing, two releases here, the dry cleaner on Maddox North and the gas station on Maddox South, but it's any area or location where the contamination has come to be located. So what you see here, that is the liability problem that Mount Baker was contemplating taking on. So they buy the property, the four parcels that Dave was describing, and the one parcel that's Maddox South. But their liability isn't limited to those properties. It's that entire plume that you see there. So we had two really, really big issues to solve, which made Dave and I really collaborate, which was how do we solve for that liability issue that I was just describing? And there's really only one way to do it under Washington's law, which is through a document called a prospective purchaser consent decree, or a PPCD. And that is a legal settlement that the prospective purchaser here, Mount Baker, so Mount Baker doesn't own it yet, they haven't bought the property. And so we're having advanced conversations with the state of Washington, the regulators and the Attorney General's office about a settlement of that liability in advance of Mount Baker purchasing the property and obtaining that liability that I just described. So that was the tool that we needed. And under a new change to the cleanup law in Washington to MOTCA, there was a change that potentially allowed a developer like Mount Baker that entered into one of these PPCDs with the state to obtain state grant funding to help defray cleanup costs. So that tool, this PPCD tool, was really critical for both liability and obtaining funds. And then the other thing that Dave and I really had to talk about was the client basically said, we don't have any funds to pay for the cleanup. So can you guys help us figure out, what fund sources may be available? So I've just described we were thinking about state grant dollars, so that was definitely one fund source. The other fund source is Phillips 66, as Dave was describing for the gas station site. Phillips 66 operated that gas station at some point in the past. And what the cleanup law allows is if you are the non-polluting developer, you come to a site that somebody else has polluted and you spend $1 cleaning up that contamination that was caused by somebody else, you now have a claim against that entity, that polluting entity, to recover your dollar. So we began then to explore, and Dave, from a technical and historical perspective, his team, to explore, whether Phillips 66 was in the chain of title and whether or not we may have a claim to recover costs against Phillips 66. But note, Phillips 66 is not responsible for the dry cleaning contamination. So that source of funds, it can only go towards what they're responsible for, which is the petroleum related contamination that comes from the gas station. And then to really get into the weeds, folks, the other possible thing that we do that we look at to fund these cleanups for clients like Mount Baker is people buy, commercial insurance policies when they're running their business. And so for the dry cleaner, clearly the people who owned and operated the dry cleaner, they're polluters, right? But the problem is there were no assets. They were all kind of mom and pop folks that operated that, sort of family run businesses. And they certainly were liable, but they just had no assets to help us pay for the cleanup. And so we drilled down one layer beyond that to say, okay, all of you folks that operated that dry cleaner that caused or contributed to the contamination that Dave was describing from the dry cleaner, did you buy insurance policies? Did you have commercial insurance policies? And with one of the former operators who we found, and old guy, long retired, the answer was yes. And the short story is, if you have one of these insurance policies that were of a certain vintage back in the 70s and 80s when this guy operated, they included pollution. And so if we were to then sue that guy, the former owner, he can then turn to his insurance company and say, I'm being sued, I have a claim, pay on my claim. And so what we persuaded this gentleman, who I believe was in his 80s at the time, was, look, dude, we won't sue you if you assign your insurance policy to Mount Baker. And so he said, where do I sign up? Very nice older gentleman. And so we basically took on his insurance claim and we made the claim. And then we got the insurance company to help fund on the dry cleaning piece because the policy was for the dry cleaner. So Dave and I began to think about all of these different sources that we could potentially pull together to pay for this. And then to jump to the next slide, thinking about the liability piece, this is literally what that caption looks like for the prospective purchaser consent decree that we negotiated and ultimately filed in Washington State Court. So it's essentially a lawsuit that you file in court, but you settle it at the same time through this prospective purchaser consent decree. And that way it's a legal settlement with the state. It's binding on the state. It's binding on our client. And so that was the solution to the liability issue. And it also protects these PPCDs, protect Mount Baker from any third party claims from any other private individuals that may have a claim related to this. And it also created eligibility for those public grant funds that I was describing. What Mount Baker has to provide in response, those are the things that the state provides. Mount Baker has to agree to do the cleanup, right? And take on those costs. So the next issue was, how are we going to pay for this cleanup and what is it going to cost? So Dave,
Yeah.
that's the ROM.
Yeah. I feel like you covered this perfectly, Mike. So yeah, we as the scientists, engineer, consultants, take the technical information and the investigation information that we've obtained, to define those plumes or the plume that you saw on the map, and we prepare what is called a rough order of magnitude remedial cost estimate, or a ROM.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, well, this is just the cover page of what it looks like. But
Right.
yeah, there are a lot of other pages that go to build up this cost. And I'll just mention the upper part of this table represents the assessment or investigation. And if you see over there to the right, the total is $847,000. So the client nonprofit didn't have the money to do the investigation. We can talk more about how that came to be. It was grant funded for the investigation. And then the cleanup component is the bottom part of this table. And we had calculated at the time that the cleanup was going to be $8 million. So this was we were telling the client at this time it was a $9 million cleanup. I think the properties, all 5 parcels, were probably worth $3 million. And so they were way underwater on this. However, they had a bold mission to transition this blighted property into a signature project in the neighborhood, because they were the properties that were blocking people from walking from the neighborhood to that transit light rail station. So yeah.
And this is how it ultimately shook out. So as Dave was describing, we got funding early from the state, grant funding, because we did that PPCD and we became eligible to fund the assessment costs. And ultimately, at the end of the day, after everything was done, after Dave and his team cleaned it up, we got a little over $7 million in grant funding from the state. We filed a claim against Phillips 66 once we had developed sort of the case to pinpoint that they were responsible for the gas station. And we, had a pretty difficult negotiation with them. As you can imagine, they didn't just fork over the money. So that was a protracted negotiation with Phillips, but ultimately we settled that and we got $1 million out of them. And then you'll remember the conversation about the insurance policy, and we took on the policy from the former dry cleaner, owner and operator, filed a claim on the insurance, and I had one of my colleagues here at my firm help with that, his practice is insurance recovery on behalf of policyholders. And so his name is Nick Gellert, and Nick really helped us on the insurance piece, and we ultimately got 3 million from the insurers. And so as Dave was just describing, the original estimate based on the information we had at that time was a little over $8 million. And as you can see here, we ended up spending cleanup costs and recovering, what is the math? A little over $11 million
And
to fund the
this was
cleanup.
this was uh this was both scary and a blessing in disguise. And the scary part was, if you remember that graphic that we had with all the red dots around the dry cleaner, we were not, yeah, okay, just click there. So because of the buildings on the properties to the west, we were not able to do as extensive of drilling on those parcels. And we found during the excavation, and there was a basement installed on this Maddox North, and we found during the excavation that those red dots extended onto the two properties further to the west. So we had way underestimated the volume of contaminated soil that would be removed from the dry cleaner release. We just couldn't get to it. And we had contingencies in there. However, the save the bacon moment was the dry cleaner elected to pay on a monthly basis and not do a cash out or just say, here's a check for whatever you estimated for the cleanup. They wanted to pay and track it on a monthly basis. And that meter kept running up, thank God, because that was the additional $2 million to dispose of chlorinated solvent, contaminated soil is very expensive. So
Well,
that
I
is,
think in the interest of time, I'm just going to
yeah,
jump to
yeah.
this last slide so you guys see what it looks like today. And this is the north, the south buildings on the other side of McClellan Street look basically the same. And, we're thrilled to have worked on this project and, thrilled to tell you that, it's fully developed, it's rented out, and, there are human beings that are living there and enjoying the affordable housing. And so it was just a great project to be part of and great to work with my friend Dave. And Jennifer, I think we'll pause it there so that we save time for questions. And do you want me to take down the screen?
Are you going to be using any more of the slides? It's up to you.
I don't know. I don't
You
know.
might.
It's
You
possible.
can.
All right, we'll just leave it up.
That's an amazing story that you chose to tell. So as we start collecting questions from the audience and from people online in the chats, I'll kick us off with a question that is like glaring to me is, you said that you were skilled in managing communication with multiple involved clients. So I'm just envisioning you had to communicate with regulators, the community, lenders, purchasers, owners, and then you two between each other. And you had to talk about grants and settlements. And I can't even imagine meeting with those folks and they say, you buy the property, you buy the problem. I mean, from that particular conversation forward, how did you manage that? And did you find roadblocks, or what were your techniques for being sure that you brought everybody along the way you needed to and each other? I'm interested in that as well.
Well, it was definitely a journey. And Jennifer, you're right. Those were all the folks, the folks we had to talk to. And so, I helped the client in the purchase and sale negotiations buy these properties. And it was sometimes a challenging conversation with those owners because let me illustrate this 1 second. So if you look at, that's not the best one. Let's go to this one. So Dave talked about not the dry cleaner property, which is the one here furthest to the east, but these other three properties were owned by just people. They were, one of them was like a little apartment complex, one was a dilapidated old house, and they were just owned by people who didn't really care that it was contaminated and weren't really interested in, discounting the purchase price because this was a major asset for them personally. And so we had to have really difficult, negotiations with them and be empathetic towards, their needs. And so that was a challenging, those were a challenging series of conversations. Um, and then with our client, Dave and I worked on a sort of a day-to-day basis with the client's director of real estate, a wonderful human being named Connor Hansen. But Mount Baker's ultimately run by a board, like most nonprofits. And so Dave and I would periodically also have to brief the board, who ultimately make the decisions for the organization. And as you can imagine, were concerned about the liability, and it wasn't their job to understand how the cleanup law works. And so we had to explain all of those things to those folks. And then Dave, you had many conversations with the regulators at Ecology about the cleanup.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. You have to. And the other piece about this consent decree is ecology owns the cleanup at that point, and we're working on behalf of the state and our client, Mount Baker. So we had to be super collaborative with the regulatory agency, and typically, my history and experience is I'm working for private developers that are running fast and doing things independently on their own, and then submitting a request for closure at the end of the project to Department of Ecology, the state entity. And so this was very different, that we were walking hand in hand with ecology. And none of this would happen, you guys, Jennifer, to answer the base question. Mike and I, number one, we like each other. Number two, we 100% respect each other's expertise, and we don't get in each other's way, but need to understand me, the legal pieces that Mike is trying to accomplish, and he, the technical pieces that I'm trying to accomplish. And that doesn't always happen in life and business. And when you find someone like that has a different skill, that's highly skilled and respected, it's the best thing. This is one of the best projects I've ever done. And a lot of it is because of this Iowa graduate sitting here talking to you.
Well, that's right back at Dave. But that is the dance, right? When you're doing these collaborations, is Dave and I each have our own expertise, and we can't be in each other's business too much about that, but we have to understand what we do. And, like I often tell people, I went to law school because I couldn't do science or math. And so Dave has been very patient to like go through it and explain to me, all of the scientific and technical details, and I've picked up a little bit of that along the way. Um, but what I will also say is when I work as the environmental lawyer with an environmental consultant, technical excellence or scientific excellence from the consultant, that's sort of like table stakes. But where it really gets good And where I really love to work with environmental consultants, and Dave is my favorite person to work with, is when I can have a strategic partner to help jointly work on the strategy to help achieve the client's goal. And that's where the technical and the legal come together, where we can jointly think about what is the strategy to get us from point A to the client's goal.
That was helpful. Thank you. It gives those of us without a science background hope. So thank you.
Yes, there is hope, I promise.
There's hope. So this is interesting, and I have this question as well. Can you discuss a little bit more that interesting process of tracking down the old owners and insurance policies from what would have been the 70s? That's fascinating. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, great question. So it is the era of specialization. And so there's actually a little consulting firm that specializes in this field that is called insurance archaeology. And Dave and I work with this firm fairly frequently, and they go find these policies. And so the first step is we have to understand and we have to find out who were the past owners and operators of the dry cleaner, right? And, maybe we'll just go to that slide. You can see, as Dave was describing, that's a really old picture. It goes back decades. And so we looked at the chain of title, we looked at who the owners and operators were, and then we had the insurance archaeology firm help us literally track down, whether any of these former owners and operators were alive through, property searches, internet searches. We had the names of the people through the title search. And so we were able to track this one, gentleman down, Mr. Wolfenbarger, who had owned and operated the property. And I described that process with him. And we were careful. We ultimately made a decision that it may be scary to have, Mike Dunning, the lawyer at the big law firm, call him up. And so we had the insurance archaeology firm talk directly to him, so that it was a little bit less of a scary conversation with him. And so once we explained to him what was going on, we crafted a very short agreement that he would agree to, that he would sign to transfer those policies over to us. And the final point, Jennifer, and thanks for whoever asked the question. There's a sort of a magic time period for when these policies work, because when the federal Superfund law was passed, all of the sudden there was this new liability. And lots of people started making claims on their policies, and the Superfund law was passed in 1980. And so by about 1985, the insurance companies said, this is not a good business for us. And so on a going forward basis, we are going to write exclusions into commercial insurance policies that say we ain't paying for this anymore. So what we look for are historical insurance policies before 1985. And if we can find one of those, there's a relatively good chance that we can at least recover something from those old policies.
That's a good tip. That's interesting. Let's take one from online now. I'll just go ahead and read it. Did any of the remediation grants require data tracking about the health of the people living in the former space, tracking cancer rates, respiratory diseases, etc.? Is there any data collection to determine how successful the remediation is or was? And I know from reading the documents that there is ongoing monitoring of the groundwater, at least I believe so. Would you like to address that question from the audience?
Dave, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, I can't answer it in the detail of that great question. I'm going to answer it this way. It's the individual health statistics are not tracked. And our goal was to get the site into a cleaned up manner so that all future residents at these properties would be safe as if they had, as if they were living on a clean greenfield property. And that is tracked and monitored and evaluated. And so that's ongoing. And on both projects, for additional security, we designed and installed a vapor membrane beneath both buildings. Why? Because we did a big, expensive soil source removal project, but there was still residual chlorinated solvents in groundwater that could vaporize and potentially get up into the building. So, and it would just take longer to clean up the groundwater over a period of years. And so those elements, both the vapor membrane barrier and groundwater monitoring, are ongoing. One other thing I would say is in the neighborhood, that was another issue that we spent weeks talking to Department of Ecology and the neighbors about, because that plume extended underneath a residential neighborhood of single family homes. It was a significant deal. And the outcome, it was interesting. Some people wanted nothing to do with it. We put letters on the doors. We knocked on doors to tell them that we were going to investigate, or would they mind if we investigated their property. Some people said, nope, don't want anything to do with it, don't want to know. Some said, boy, we've been worried about that dry cleaner. We didn't know it was contaminated. We suspected. We're so glad you're here. And so it was all over the map. We actually did a big vapor intrusion study along that block of just to the south of the right side of that blue groundwater plume, and we were able to show that the vapor intrusion pathway and potential in those homes was not significant, except for that property just along McClellan Street, that rectangle building, which was a dentist's office. And we had lots of conversation with the dentist, and he was one of the people that was really excited that we were in there to clean up the site, and recognized it would take a few years. But that's probably the best way I could answer that question. It was a very good question.
Yeah, the only thing, Dave, the only thing I would add is both the prospective purchaser consent decree and the grant required that we clean this site up under state supervision. And the way that, one of the things that the methodology to get to cleanup is the state has set cleanup levels for, hundreds and hundreds of various substances in soil and in groundwater and in soil vapor. And those levels are calibrated for the land use. And so the most stringent cleanup levels are for residential use, which of course this was. So under state supervision, our client had to clean this up to those stringent standards to make sure that it was safe for people to live in those buildings.
Along those lines, what about continuing liability if something crops up on the former contaminated property?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the client's liability continues until we get to the cleanup levels for all of the contaminants. So they have a continuing responsibility under the prospective purchaser consent decree to complete the cleanup. And so Dave, jump in here, but as Dave was describing, we did, maybe I can find a slide on this. We did the active cleanup, right? Removed all of that contaminated soil, and now we've got, the plume, getting rid of the rest of the groundwater plume. And so that, as Dave described, that's going to take some time. We've removed the cancer, right? You get that contaminated soil out, and then it's just going to take time for the groundwater to reach those very stringent cleanup levels that I described. And so we Mount Baker are not done, and we haven't fully gotten closeout, regulatory closeout from the state, and we won't until we reach the cleanup levels for both soil and groundwater, and that's going to take more time.
Interesting, thank you. Couple of technical questions. So, what did you do with the contaminated soil? Where does that go?
It went to a large Subtitle D landfill in Oregon. It was excavated from the site, trucked to a transfer station in downtown Seattle, loaded on train cars, and then to a permitted landfill.
So Dave's reference to Subtitle D is a subtitle in the Federal Hazardous Waste Statute. The other acronym is RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And so there are certain landfills that have special facilities where you can take this material and dispose of it, and it will be managed properly.
I think actually check that. I think up in that northern corner, some of the very hottest material actually went into train cars and out to Utah for incineration. So that's a common tactic. You spend a bunch of money up front to, like Mike said, remove the cancer, take it to a managed and monitored facility. Without doing that, you just can't do developments. I think the follow-up question would be, well, why don't you destroy it? You're just moving the problem. Sure, that is true, and we have to deal with that on every site. But you would not have brownfields redevelopment if you spent your money and time to treat the material in place. That would take way too long, and you wouldn't be able to do deals. The groundwater, on the other hand, we are doing that. So we did multiple rounds of chemical injections to increase the speed and the rate of degradation of the groundwater plume.
Well, we're closing in on the end of our time here, but I will end up with one more of a practice type question, I guess, for both of you. So finding the funding was done in creative ways and strategies. So the question is, was this work done pro bono, or how do you account for your particular fees in a situation like this? Or how do others, I guess, too?
Well, that's a tricky question to answer because as a practicing lawyer, my fee arrangements with my clients is attorney-client privileged. But what I would say is not all my clients pay the same rate. And so there were definitely business conversations that I had with Mount Baker, understanding that Mount Baker is a small nonprofit, as to what, my engagement with that client would be. And then the other thing I think I can say is one of the other things I think, Dave, both you and I have gotten very familiar with is the challenges for nonprofit affordable housing developers, like how they fund themselves, put sort of cleanups aside. And so typically what they get, or a large part of their funding will be, tax credit investors, or they'll get other government funding from state and federal sources, and those monies tend to come in tranches, right? And so their cash flow tends to be kind of herky-jerky. They'll get big buckets of grant funding or big buckets of lender funding at certain points. And so the other creative thing that I did with Mount Baker is to say, well, maybe, you don't have to pay any of my bills for, 6 months or 8 months or 9 months, and we'll just, hold on to those and let me partner with you and how you do your cash flow. And then we'll catch up once you get these tranches of funding in. And so that made it a lot easier for Mount Baker to retain me.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that. And with that, I think we're going to have to close today. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to our audience for the great questions. We didn't get to all of them. I'm sorry.